Hello and welcome to episode 16 of
The Complete Charting Guide.
There is no recommended content for this video. Let's just start with the definition. Difficulty is a number on a scale of 0 to 10. It refers exclusively to how tough the expert chart is and is not to be confused with lower difficulty, which refers to the different game modes of easy, medium, and hard. Now, difficulty is a tough topic to explain. Every chart has a difficulty that is objectively correct. But the paradoxical thing is that the more you try to constrain the rules to define each rank, the more edge cases that will pop up to break those rules. The result is that our guidelines are loose and vague, but our final ranking has to be precise so that our charts fit in with all the others. But we do have a guide. I'll link it in the description if you want to check it really quick, or you can find it in the pins in the Clone Hero Discord as always. Huge kudos to everyone who worked on that guide because I've tried over and over to rewrite it in more specific terms, but I can't. So here's what I'll be doing. In the 0 to 10 guide, there are example charts given for each rank. I will be going through most of these and talking through why they've been given the rank they are, and basically just going over what the written guide says too. And one last thing before we start. The more you work with charts and difficulty, the more you will build an intuition for it. Eventually, all you'll need to do is glance at a chart and you'll be able to tell what difficulty it is without thinking about any of these rules or guidelines. So keep with it and eventually you'll find that it's become second nature. There's more I should explain, but this intro is going on long enough, so I'll just explain it as we come across things. A difficulty 0 chart is the lowest and thus the easiest possible ranking. In the background is a very cut and clear difficulty 0. I don't think I need to explain why this is so low. It's so trivial it could literally pass off as an easy chart. Next, this is on the harder end of difficulty 0. Notice how there's a lot of empty space in this chart and the patterns are very repetitive. There's absolutely no techniques or special tricks required to just press the correct fret and strum. If you're familiar with how tough the lower difficulties are from the main games, you could say that difficulty 0 should at most be as tough as a hard chart. And I know we haven't seen any chords in these examples, but chords can still be included in difficulty 0. Difficulty 1 is still trivial, but definitely a reminder that we are playing on expert. Besides the intro chords, you can see the verse here is basically as tough as the difficulty 0 we just looked at. While this plays in the background, this seems like a good time to talk about overlap. I know I said that every chart has an objectively correct rank earlier, but when we're talking about charts that are on the line between difficulties, such as a chart between 0 and 1 for example, you could safely say that the chart is a high difficulty 0 or a low difficulty 1. This comes back to that the rules are loose, so it's possible for a chart to be either a 0 or a 1 at the same time. Anyway, going back to this chart, the chorus with the 3 gem chords is what brings this from a 0 to 1, even though the repetitive and trivial verse would be a 0 by itself. Here's an example for the high end of 1. You can immediately tell that this is a lot tougher than the last chart. After the intro of taps, these chords require some alt strumming, which is when the player has to strum up and down in order to hit the notes, and not just strum down. Next is this verse, which is way faster than before. Although I haven't featured any, there can be solos in difficulty 1, but they probably shouldn't be much faster than the intro of this chart. Difficulty 2 is a whole nother step up from difficulty 1, as it should be. Alt strumming should not be a surprise here, but let's be clear that not every chart is difficult in the same way. For example, in this song, the difficulty mainly comes from the different chord shapes and the rhythms. In a different difficulty 2, there might be no chords or alt strumming at all, but instead it would have more and faster solos than this chart. As far as I can tell, there's 6 main different factors for difficulty: speed, techniques required, stamina required, visual complexity, rhythm, and hand movement. Anyway, difficulty 2 charts can also include reset strumming, which is something required for this chart. Reset strumming is when the player has to let go of the strum bar for a little bit in order to avoid overstrumming, and also to start each set of notes on a down strum instead of awkwardly trying to start on an up strum. For our high-end example of difficulty 2, honestly this riff is probably equal in difficulty to the last example, but in a different way, as I was just talking about. A significant portion of the difficulty here actually comes from the visual complexity. If you can read the chart correctly, it isn't too hard to perform the strums in the right spots. But you have to think that for a beginner, making sense of all these hopos and strums mixed together isn't so trivial. Maybe they would resort to just strumming every note like I used to when I was still new to expert. But this riff isn't the reason this is a high difficulty 2. The solo later in the song, which I'm only showing about a third of it, is what brings this from a middling 2 up to a high 2. You can see there's some short bursts of higher notes per second, but no long phrases that are all that fast. Anyway, I could break this down more, but you get the point, and we still have 8 more difficulties to get through, so let's keep it moving. This first example's main riff looks like it could be a high difficulty 2 instead. Again, there are overlaps. Anyway, let's jump straight to the bridge here where we can see exactly why it was named a low 3, as these patterns and chords have a very high visual complexity compared to what you'd expect at difficulty 2, as well as just being more difficult to play in general due to the slightly higher speed. For the high 3, while we watch this slow guitar solo, let's talk about difficulty 3's specifications. A player at difficulty 3 should be expected to be able to handle almost any pattern at this speed here. Additionally, there will be more frequent intense bursts of activity, which we can see right here. Phrases like this should not be extended for long times at difficulty 3, but bursts of it like this are totally expected. Difficulty 4 is where we start seeing charts that demand consistent speed from the player. Songs in difficulty 4 might require basic tapping for the player to FC, which is where the player needs to take their hand off the strum bar and use it to help their left hand to fret the notes. Difficulty 4 is also where you'll see most of the charts that have pretty easy main riffs, but have a few sections that are much tougher. Usually that's the solo. Our first example is Cult of Personality. If you know the song, you know that this has a pretty long solo, like around 2 minutes long, but the main riff is pretty easy in comparison. So although the solo isn't the whole song in this case, this speed is nothing out of the ordinary for difficulty 4. Next, this chart's main riff is about a 3 in difficulty, but the solo has this crazy section which brings the chart up to a 4. There's not much else to say about difficulty 4, but I will throw this in here. Charts with one section way harder than the rest tend towards the lower end of the difficulties. If you find yourself with a chart like this, then a good tip is to imagine the difficulty to pass the chart and the difficulty to FC the chart and averaging those scores. Difficulty 5 is where we start to lose specifications in the 0 to 10 guide for each difficulty. From here on, the explanations are mostly just, it's harder than before, or it's easier than what comes next. So we're going to have to rely on the examples to see what kind of charts belong in each rank. This first example is difficulty 5 because of the strumming pattern. Maybe it doesn't look so hard, but the entire song is nothing but this. All it would take is one overstrum, or fretting slightly too early, or letting go of the frets slightly too late and the FC is lost. Additionally, trying to keep track of if your fingers on your fretting hand should be pressed or unpressed while also managing the constant reset strumming on a strumming hand can get confusing. This next example has speed that you would expect from a difficulty 4 chart, but the pattern is more difficult and many players would need to resort to alt tapping here to FC this. Alt tapping is just like normal tapping where the strumming hand comes over to the frets, but alt tapping has the idea that the left hand and right hand alternate between phrases to share the load of playing notes equally. In this case, the most simple solution would be to have the left hand play the lower shapes and the right hand play the higher shapes. This final example for 5 seems like the speed again could fit right in as a difficulty 4, but the patterns are more complex and the hand movements required are more tricky. Also, the entire song is one long 4-minute solo like this without any breaks, bringing the difficulty up to a 5. I won't spend too much time on difficulty 6, but again, everything is just getting harder. You can see the solos in the background are faster, but I can understand how at this point if you don't have the skill to play at this level, it can seem hard to figure out how this is different from difficulty 5. Like, isn't this the same as this? It really does just come from having a slightly faster notes per second, which makes it much more difficult to play with only one hand. Also, the patterns here are more broken apart as compared to the difficulty 5 example where the patterns are very connected going up and down, although the difficulty 5 patterns aren't as nice as the difficulty 4 patterns, which are even simpler yet still have a similar speed. Anyway, especially if you're just starting out, it's doubtful that you will be charting difficulty 6 or above charts, so it isn't vitally important that you can tell the difference between them, but if you have the skills to play these charts, then you can just feel how much harder these difficulty 6 examples are from difficulty 5. For the last example in difficulty 6, we still have our bursts, and here is a burst that seems pretty ridiculous. The reason this is still allowed to be in difficulty 6 is because this burst only lasts less than 10 seconds, and because the pattern is actually very repetitive, making the alt tapping easier and keeping the visual complexity lower. Difficulty 7 is where you'll find the hardest of the console songs from Guitar Hero and Rock Band. You might recognize this intro as Through the Fires and Flames, one of the hardest console charts ever released. Just going through these songs here again, if you don't have the skill to play these charts, you might find it impossible to see how this is different from a difficulty 6. And it really is just a slight bump to the notes per second along with broken apart patterns, which puts a lot more stress on the player. Here's a chart that is difficulty 7 because of strumming, which is pretty uncommon up here because most players who can play at this level have their rhythm and strumming mastered. This strumming is so hard because the speed is nearly impossible to keep up for the 4 minutes straight that this song demands of you unless you are rake strumming, in which case you have to be careful not to overstrum. Oh, new technique. Rake strumming is where you take multiple fingers and just fling them through the strum bar to get multiple strums per motion. Difficulty 8 is where we start getting to the truly ridiculous charts. You will be hard pressed to find songs performed by humans at difficulty 8 or above, and most difficulty 8s are bleep bloops, or songs made specifically to be impossibly hard and be charted for Clone Hero. Every difficulty 8 is going to demand advanced techniques and the ability to read and hit these crazy patterns. I don't really have much to say about difficulty 9. Yep. It's harder than difficulty 8. This is so far beyond my skill level that I can't give any commentary on this anymore, so let's just sit back and enjoy the show. Finally, we're at difficulty 10. At this point, only a few players in the entire world can FC these songs. There is no upper limit to how hard a difficulty 10 can be, but you have to ask yourself if it's worth it to make a chart so hard that only a few people in the world can play it. While we watch the rest of this, let me thank you for watching this video. This one took me a lot more work than usual to make, especially from all the failed attempts at making more specific guidelines for the difficulties, so I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe if you want to convince me to quit my job to make more charting guide stuffs. Anyway, next video will be about naming genres, so until then, happy charting.